My first contact with Srila Prabhupada, my first personal contact, was when I went on a morning walk with him. I was just a young boy. I think I hadn't even joined the temple, but I had heard that Srila Prabhupada was coming, and the devotees encouraged me to stay overnight and see Prabhupada. He came, and he went on a morning walk before class, as he does. And we went near Bury Place. There was a small park, Russell Square, and there was about 10 devotees with Srila Prabhupada. And I was the new boy, I was the bhakta, I was the... so I was behind. There was a jostling, as I later discovered, but I was behind. And I had a great difficulty to understand Srila Prabhupada. He had this unusual accent, this Bengali accent with which I just wasn't familiar. I think I was about 17 or 18. I hadn't had a lot of exposure to Indian people anyhow. And I was straining to hear what he said. So I was walking behind and I was straining with, just trying to catch the words, and there was the feet on the gravel, there was a lot of ambient sound, so I was straining to kind of filter things through. And I clipped Prabhupada's heel. And Srila Prabhupada walked about 2 or 3 paces without the shoe on. And so he stopped, everyone stopped, and Prabhupada turned and he looked at me. And he knew what I had clipped his heel. And he said, "You must always walk 3 feet behind the spiritual master." And I was completely mortified. And there was this one devotee. He said to me, he said, "This is a grave offense." He said, "You should immediately kill yourself." He said, "You should jump in the Thames, jump off the river," and immediately, he said, for purification. So I thought, oh no, what have I done? I haven't even started, and I've set off on a bad foot. So it was much later, I was recounting to one of my sannyasi godbrothers, and he said, "That is the moment when Srila Prabhupada accepted you as his disciple." He said that was his first instruction to you. You must always walk 3 paces behind the spiritual master. Srila Prabhupada, he would give the most wonderful practical examples to explain the most difficult philosophical concepts for us, his aspiring disciples. One time in Vrindavan, Srila Prabhupada was struggling to present to us in terms that we could understand the fact that everything is absolutely conscious and sentient in the spiritual world. So he paused for a short time, and then he said, just like when Radharani is cooking for Krishna, she will ask the rice in the pot, "Are you ready yet?" And the rice will say, "No, not yet, give me a few more minutes." So Srila Prabhupada, he was very tricky at times also, and he knew the mentality of different people and how exactly to deal with them. In Vrindavan, Prabhupada was pretty exasperated because none of his disciples were willing to stay in Vrindavan, the management, or were they qualified to deal with the goings-on in India and so on. So he always had a great difficulty finding management to run the place and to stay there. Very, very, which again was why he had spent so much time there. So one time he thought that a solution was to get some local trusted people involved so that they would be our trustees and they would take care of things very nicely. So there was one gentleman, he was a brahmachari, lifelong brahmachari, and he lived right round the corner. And eventually, he just lived around the corner, and devotees got to know him. They brought him to Prabhupada. He had some type of, I guess, some kind of rheumatoid conditions in his hip, so he had difficulty. It was painful for him to move around and so on. But he would take the rickshaw. He had been a brahmachari, but he had a mill in which he would mill different seeds and oil seeds and so on. So he had made a bit of money, he had taken care of his family and so on. But he was a sadhu at heart. He had retired early and he just wanted to be involved in his bhajan. He knew the entire Bhagavad-gita by heart, and he would take a rickshaw from Raman Reti into town in which he would recite half of the Bhagavad-gita, and then on the way back he would recite the other half. So he was just completely brahmachari and trained and focused and just really wanted to complete his bhajan in this lifetime. Of course, Srila Prabhupada wanted him to get involved in helping with the temple. So there was a conflict between them, and Prabhupada would ask him, and he'd find all these ways to avoid doing things, and Prabhupada very much was... so there was this chess game going on between them, and each was resistant. He was very respectful of Srila Prabhupada, and he recognized Srila Prabhupada's superior position. And Srila Prabhupada would explain to him that preaching is more important than bhajan, that this is a higher calling. And so he was kind of getting won over, but very, very resistant. And of course he had a whole lifetime of planning out what he was going to do. He was living very peaceful until Srila Prabhupada and the ISKCON devotees moved into the property down the road. So one day Prabhupada called for him, and Bhagavad-gita came in and sat down. Prabhupada was sitting at his desk in his room in Krishna Balaram temple. So Prabhupada said to him, he said, "It is the duty of every Indian gentleman to teach the teachings of Lord Krishna. Do you agree?" And Bhagavad-gita says, yes, and he agreed with this. And Prabhupada said, "It is also the duty of every Indian gentleman to set aside some time in his life to propagate these teachings. Do you agree?" And Bhagavad-gita was, yes, I agree. So there was a whole number of things which Prabhupada, and he said, Prabhupada said, if there was a need, if Western people would come to a person with, they're eager for Krishna, this gentleman, he would help. Bhagavad-gita said, yeah, he was agreeing. So point by point, Prabhupada got him to agree that, if needs be, then a person would set aside their particular devotional aspirations in order to, help people and spread Lord Chaitanya's Sankirtan movement. So they were talking for 10 minutes. I was sitting in the room listening. So he was talking for about 10 minutes. So then Prabhupada said, "Brahmananda?" I said, "Yes, Prabhupada." He said, "Bring the paper." So Brahmananda brought the paper, and he gave it to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada handed it to Bhagavad-gita. And Bhagavad-gita he looked so alarmed. And later I learned it was a legal document, which Bhagavad-gita had to sign to say that he was the new trustee of the Krishna Balaram temple. So he was just absolutely shocked that, he was trying to do his bhajan, now he is a manager of the temple, the trustee in charge of everything. He was just so, and then Prabhupada just went over one by one the points that he had made to which Bhagavad-gita had agreed, every single one of them. Prabhupada just went through 10 points, all the points that he had given that Bhagavad-gita had agreed to. And the natural conclusion was that he would officially sign this document, which would just legalize all of the points which he had just agreed to in the last 10 minutes. So he was looking at the document, and Prabhupada just went over all the points again, and he went over the points, and Bhagavad-gita just started laughing. He just, he realized that he had been outplayed. He had been, it was checkmate, and so he just laughed, and he took the pen, and he just surrendered to Prabhupada, and he said, "Okay," so, and then he was the trustee for a great many years. So, one day, one devotee came from Punjab, and he came down and he said, "Srila Prabhupada, I'm preaching in Punjab." He said, "There's a gentleman who owns land in Kurukshetra, and he's willing to give us the land to build a temple." Srila Prabhupada said, "Tell the gentleman that we will build a very nice temple there with Krishna and Arjuna, Radha Parasarati. He would we build a very nice temple with Krishna on the chariot, but we'll build that time. But he must give us very clear title to the land." He said, "We are not interested to develop another person's land. If he gives us the land, gives us clear title to the land," he said, "we will build a very nice temple there." So then he said to the devotee, he said, "Who is your preaching partner? You have come alone. Who is your preaching partner?" And the brahmachari says, "Prabhupada, I don't have a preaching partner. I'm just there by myself." So Prabhupada said, "This is not good. He said, you must have a preaching partner. So then he turned to the GBC of Vrindavan. India had been split into several zones. So at the time, Vrindavan was a separate zone. Vrindavan was a separate zone from Delhi. So he turned to the GBC from Vrindavan and he said, give a preaching... No, I'm sorry. Delhi and Vrindavan were one zone, but it was a separate zone from Punjab. So he said, give a partner, give someone to preach with this person, give someone. So the GBC there says, Prabhupada, I don't have any extra people. It wasn't his zone, he had no interest to give a good man away to another zone. He said, Srila Prabhupada, I don't have any extra people. And Prabhupada said, there are so many people who come for darshan to see me every day. He said, this is just a complete mismanagement. This is a complete waste. He said, one of those people, they can come. They've got nothing else to do if they're coming to see me. He said, they can be the preaching partner. And he said, no, Srila Prabhupada, he said, I've stopped that. No one else is coming. He said, I don't have any extra people. And he says, well, give him. And he pointed to me. I was just a young boy. I was the prachari. He said, give him. He said, he can preach. He said, let him go. And the GBC said, Srila Prabhupada, he said, we need him. He said, he is the pujari here. Srila Prabhupada says, pujari, he says, this is 5th class. He said, anyone can offer some tulsi and some water. He said, let him go and preach. He said, preaching, this is 1st class. He said, he should go and preach. So I joined the person. I was his preaching partner. Prabhupada said, pujari, he said, this is 5th class. Anyone can do this. Let him preach. Often Srila Prabhupada would give very concise philosophical purports. I remember one time he was explaining that Sahajya was much better than Mayavadi. He said, better to be a Sahajya than to be a Mayavadi. He said, with the Sahajya, there is some type of connection to Krishna. He said it's not considered a very, very elevated connection, but at least some connections there. He said, but for Mayavadi, he said there was just absolutely no hope. Srila Prabhupada was very surprising. He was a very amazing man to me. I was constantly surprised at his different qualities, at his different reactions. He was just very, very amazing. I was completely intrigued. I was a young boy. I was living in the temple. I stayed a year at the Berry Place temple before I went to India. So it was just in this first I may have been a devotee for about 6 months. So I was up in Prabhupada's room chanting and watching Prabhupada sitting behind his desk chanting. He had a very, very low desk on the first floor of Berry Place. He had a very, very low coffee table type desk. And he had a low, not so much an asan, but he had cushions. He had a big cushion he sat on, and there was a round type of bolster cushion behind him, and 2 at each side. So he was just laying very casually, chanting his chanting, and I was just chanting. There was 2 or 3 of us in the room chanting. So this one devotee came in. He had been a devotee for 2 years. He liked to boast, I'm the first devotee in Europe. I've been a devotee for 2 years. I'm a Brahmin. He was very, and we thought he was just such an advanced devotee because he was 2 years and we had just been a few months. So he came into the room and he was very dramatic, and he said, Srila Prabhupada, he said, every time I feel I'm making advancement, he said, I have a fall down. He said, this has happened so many times. He said, I just do not know if I can find the strength to pick myself up again. So I was looking at Prabhupada, and Prabhupada just totally surprised me. He lay back on his cushion with his head facing the ceiling, and he just rippled with laughter. And I had never seen Prabhupada laugh. It was a whole body laugh. He was heaving and laughing. His whole body was moving. And I was just completely amazed, because hitherto I had saw this very grave, very philosophical, and he was just laughing like a young boy. And it seemed to go on really for 2 or 3 minutes. I was just totally bewildered and totally surprised. And then Srila Prabhupada brought his head back down, and he had a nice fatherly smile. And he looked at the devotee and he said, just as a child, an infant, he said, just as an infant, when learning to walk, he said he falls down so many times, but he picks himself up and persists and learns to walk. He said after some time he can run, he can jump. Srila Prabhupada said, do so many wonderful athletic things. He said, but do not think you are a big advanced devotee when you are still an infant in spiritual life. So one day there was about 6 or 8 people in his room, and I was sitting there listening, and he was asking these people to come and join him, that they should, help in Lord Chaitanya's mission. There was such a need in the Western world. It was so, bereft of any spiritual understanding. There was such a need, and the Western people are so keen. They're so eager for this. We have so many temples and selling so many. He said, "You please come and help me." So he said, these my disciples. He said they know nothing. I need people to instruct them. So one Western devotee, he was listening, and he said, "But Prabhupada, not all of your devotees." He said, "What about the pundits?" And Prabhupada said, "Pundits?" He said, "What pundits?" He said, "Prabhupada, your Western pundits, your Western disciples, the pundits." And Prabhupada said, "Pundits?" And he said to the audience, he said, "They do not know how to go to the market to buy themselves an apple." He said, "We have no pundits." Srila Prabhupada was very, very clever in giving philosophical concepts in a very clear, concise, practical way. One day he explained, he gave a story one day. He said there was a king, and the king had a Brahmin who was his advisor. And some of the other ministers, they were a little upset that the Brahmin advisor, he would get so many facilities, but he didn't seem to do too much. They said, "We are so busy going around the kingdom collecting taxes and overseeing the borders and so many things, but this Brahmin, he just doesn't seem to do much, yet he has so much facility, and this is upsetting us a bit, and we would like him not to, hang around the palace anymore." So the king said, "Let me consider your offer. Let me consider your request." And he said, "I will discuss with you in the morning." He said, "In the meantime," he said, "I would like you to tell me the concise weight of the 2 royal elephants. There's the he elephant and there's the she elephant." And he said, "I would like to know exactly what they weigh." He said, "Could you please do this for me? And when you come tomorrow," he said, "give me this information." So the next morning, he asked for the Brahmin to come to his room, his state room. So the Brahmin was there, and then the ministers arrived, and they said, he said, "What is the weight of the elephant?" And they said, "Well, we don't exactly know, because we put him on the scale, but the scale broke, and then we tried to hoist them with ropes, and then the ropes broke, but we have an idea. We think." And the king says, "Well, do you know precisely what they weigh?" They said, "No, I'm afraid we don't know." He said, "Okay." He said, "Panditji," he said, "I would like you to weigh concisely the 2 royal elephants." He said, "Can you do this for me?" So the Pandit said, "My lord," he said, may I have the use of the royal barge?" And the king said, "Yes, of course." And he said, "May I have access for a short period to the grain storehouses where we keep the palace rice?" And the king said, "Yes." He said, "I will give you this information in a few hours." So the king invited them all to come back in the afternoon. So in the afternoon, the Pandit, he was waiting. He said, "A little more time, sir." Then some messenger came and gave them the information. He said, "King," he said, "Sir," he said, the male elephant weighs so many thousand kilos, so many pounds, so many this. He gave a concise figure. He said, "And the she elephant, she's a little lighter, she weighs this. And the king says, "Well, how did you arrive at this information?" He said, "Well, sir," he said, "I first of all, one at a time, I put the elephants on the royal barge." He said, then I measured how much the water had been displaced. He said, then, bag by bag, I put rice in. It came to that amount. He said, then we simply counted the rice. He said, I gave instructions for them to do this. So he said, the messenger has just arrived with this information. He said, so by this water displacement, and then get an equal displacement by known measures of rice in precise amounts in the bags. He said, then we counted. He said, this is exactly what they weigh. So then he turned to the ministers and he said, so now do you understand why I keep Panditji? And then Prabhupada went on to explain that there was four different varnas. He said that there was the Kshatriya, the Brahmin, and he said the Brahmin is governed by lazy intelligence. He said this minister, this advisor, he was a lazy man, but an intelligent man. He said this is the Brahmins. He said, and the Kshatriyas, he said they are active intelligence. And he said the Vaishyas, he said they are lazy foolish. Lazy foolishness. He said this is the Vaishya. And he said the Sudras, they are active foolishness. So he said these are the four divisions: Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Sudra. Lazy foolishness, active foolishness, lazy intelligence, and active intelligence. Prabhupada. So just in a very, very simple, very, very concise way, Prabhupada just explained what were the characteristics of the different orders.